The defense secretary denies it, but extensive reporting indicates massive stresses to personnel aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier. Our Charlie Daggett tells us about the toll of this record-long deployment. There is renewed talk, a lot of it, about a federal plea deal potentially with Luigi Mangione in the 2024 ambush shooting death of United Healthcare's CEO. We will look at the death penalty and double jeopardy implications. What's in your wallet? That's Capital One's catchphrase. You know it. How about what's with that money laundering? Well, it's a live issue with President Trump and accounts of his that Capital One closed. Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Let me welcome you to the Takeout. President Trump and like-minded Republicans don't like to call the war with Iran what it is, a war. They prefer silly euphemisms like excursion or skirmish. Funny. I can't remember Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth ever referring to excursion fighters or skirmish fighters. Nope. He calls his charges war fighters. And what's going on with Iran? It's a war. Tens of thousands of U.S. military personnel on land and at sea have been at war since February 28th. 18 Americans have so far died in that war, and at least 450 have been wounded, though the number of wounded could be higher because of delays in Pentagon reporting and disputes over injury classifications. These are the most visible effects of war, death and injury. There are numerous other effects. Higher tempo of operations, stress on weaponry and personnel, fatigue and isolation. These pains are especially prevalent for sailors and Marines on long sea deployments. The bigger the vessel, the greater number and intensity of stressors. Which brings us to the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln. Its crew of about 5,000 sailors and Marines deployed from San Diego November 21st. That deployment was supposed to end in May. It has been repeatedly extended with no date set for return to port. The Military Times and the Navy Times have reported cases of sailors either going overboard or attempting to do so. There are also reports of maintenance issues and food shortages. Today, Hegseth said those reports were exaggerated. Even so, word came today that the USS George Washington will relieve the Lincoln. When, though, that remains unclear. War this is. All U.S. personnel in the region know it. They are living the risks as operational pressures and demands increase. And we're going to pick it up there with our senior national security correspondent, Charlie Daggett, who's with me here at the family table. Charlie, take it from there.
Well, when we talk about a normal deployment, if we can call it a normal deployment, the Abraham Lincoln would have been deployed, she said, for about 6 months. It's now going on 9, and there's no real end to it. And one of the more concerning numbers is 240, 250 days without a port of call, where you're going to have the sailors and Marines get a bit of a break. The other thing we have to point out that this is not just at sea, this is at war. This is kinetic, as the military like to call it, right? So you're going to have jets taking off 10,000 sorties. We have that confirmed. 10,000 sorties in this recent conflict against Iran. So you're talking about a huge operational tempo. That has wear and tear on the deck of the Abraham Lincoln, more importantly on the personnel. I just got off a Zoom call with a father that sent his son to war. It's his first deployment. Now, they all know that's what you sign up for. Not necessarily that your son or daughter is going to go to war, but is going to join and serve.
You understand there's a risk.
There's a risk involved. It's a long deployment, and there are risks because the Abraham Lincoln has come under attempted attacks from drone and missile strikes, and they've been intercepted. But it's real, it's ongoing, it's exhausting for the crew. And, you know, they're doing all they can. The Navy has said they're supplying the team with everything that they need in terms of, you know, food and rations, et cetera. But families have expressed to the Navy Secretary Hung Kao last week concerns about their mental health, their mental well-being, and to make sure that they are being
and to
treated
try to
this
get
way.
some idea of when this deployment is going to end.
When it's going to end, when it's going to be over. And as you said, the George Washington is on the way there. And I have to point out again that when the Abraham Lincoln set sail, it was going to the Pacific. It changed direction when it started to be needed, and again, with no end in sight.
And you've been on that vessel, have you not,
I have
Charlie?
indeed, yeah.
Describe it for us.
Okay, so I was there back in 2019, but I was at the Strait of Hormuz with rising tensions against Iran. They weren't in a conflict zone, right? It wasn't kinetic. However, those takeoffs and landings were nonstop. They were around the clock, through the night. We witnessed them ourselves. And of course, sailors and Marines would get used to those kind of quarters, but boy, is it crowded in there. It's very claustrophobic. It's cold because they want to make sure that there's no disease spread there. You're 4 bunks. It's very crowded and claustrophobic, and you're on top of one another, and there is an intensity. And again, that's reflecting a, quote, peacetime deployment, not a conflict.
And there's also some things we need to catch ourselves up on what happened at Fort Hood. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so this is an Apache helicopter that crashed yesterday afternoon at Fort Hood. We spoke to the Army who run the Apache helicopter. It's a 2-person helicopter, 2-person crew. They confirmed that it went down around 1:35 local time. They're not exactly sure. Both the crew members were killed. They're not exactly sure what brought the Apache down. The Apache historically doesn't have that scrappy a record. As a matter of fact, an Apache was attacked or attempted attack in the Strait of Hormuz, and those crew members were safely recovered and safely rescued. So they're not exactly sure the details of what happened, but this is America's.
This was a part of a training exercise.
It was a training exercise, and this is America's premier attack helicopter. Part of that training and part of what the Apache does well is this low-level flying that may have factored into it, but at this point, we don't know whether that was a pilot error or mechanical error. An investigation's underway.
To our knowledge, has the family's been notified?
Well, we have a 24-hour period before we learn the names, and I think we're pretty much entering that window now.
They're being notified. Okay, very much. Thank you. Charlie,
Thank you.
A pleasure. I want to bring in Matthew Kronig, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, and he served in the Department of Defense and Intelligence Community during the George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump first administration. Great to see you.
Great to be back.
A couple of things. Defense Secretary Hegg said today that the U.S. can hold the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz as long as needed. Is that true?
I think it is true, especially if it's a big priority. Not simple, of course. Some of the challenges Charlie was talking about with
you would need
long
extended deployments. I mean, that's a big deal.
It's a big deal, but I think the U.S.
And you would also, even if you're going to end deployments, you need to rotate things out, which means you're putting a lot of energy and effort and attention in one part of the world, leaving other parts of the world a little less attended to.
That's absolutely right. And one of the Pentagon's big fears right now is simultaneity, the risk of simultaneous conflicts in multiple theaters. And so if you're already in one conflict in the Middle East, does mean that the United States is not going to be well positioned if something were to kick off in Europe or Asia.
So if you're an average American, or even if you're paying really, really close attention to this, in the last 24 hours, you've seen 2 headlines. President Trump saying, we run the Strait of Hormuz. Iran saying today through its foreign minister, no, we run the Strait of Hormuz. How should we interpret that?
I think the reality is neither controls the Strait of Hormuz. So the Strait of Hormuz, of course, this waterway through which much of the world's energy goes.
About 20%.
But now way down, something like a quarter or a third is only getting through.
Like 8 vessels yesterday, according to Reuters.
Yeah, so the United States is, with this blockade, doing a good job of preventing Iran from shipping in and out, and is trying to escort other ships through. But the threat of Iran holding these ships at risk with its drones and missiles is enough to deter most commercial shippers from going through. The insurers and owners of these ships don't want their people getting shot at. And so even though Iran doesn't control the strait, it is doing a good job of deterring shipping through the strait.
Those who watch the region closely are no doubt paying attention to what's going on in Yemen. Houthis are aligned with Iran. They're supported by them militarily and financially. They are now increasing their attacks on Saudi Arabia and around the region. How big a deal is that?
It's a big deal, and Iran is the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism, according to the State Department, and they've funded and backed the Houthis for years. And so
but the Houthis had been sitting this out for a very long time, but they're jumping back in. What should we conclude from that?
Yeah, well, I think what happened is that Saudi Arabia and UAE and others were trying to route around their energy supplies around the Strait of Hormuz to the Red Sea.
A kind of a plan B.
A plan B, and Iran is now trying to cut off that option and telling its Houthi allies, let's start attacking Saudi Arabia and start attacking this shipping through the Red Sea. And so that is creating even more dilemmas for Saudi Arabia and other shippers. So they're looking for other routes in addition to those two.
What's the plan C? There are no other routes that I'm aware of, are there?
Well, they can go north through Egypt and the Suez Canal.
Okay, right.
But yeah, that does really limit the options if both the Red Sea and the Strait of Hormuz are cut off.
And if this continues, do the Saudis have to respond? And is this beginning a escalatory ladder?
I think we are seeing the conflict regionalize, and other actors are getting involved. So we've already seen Saudi Arabia, for example, conduct strikes on Iranian-backed militias in Iraq. I think they probably will hit back against the Houthis in Yemen. And so I do think there is the risk of the war spreading even more throughout the region.
That does not sound like good news. Matt Kronig, I appreciate it very much. Thank you so much. Ed O'Keefe joins us now. How are you, Ed? Good to see you on the North Lawn. So what is the latest from the White House on what Matt and Charlie and I were just talking about? Deployment, stresses, and the regionality of this conflict.
Well, the vice president on another network a little while ago was asked about Iran and said in part that the president continues to use diplomatic, military, and economic tools, he said. What I think is really going on from the inside is that we're using those tools very selectively, very strategically, to get the outcome that the President of the United States needs to get for the benefit of the American people. And he said later that this entire conflict remains a, quote, inherently unpredictable thing because the Iranians themselves are unpredictable and they sometimes don't honor the commitments they've made to us. Understatement of the week, perhaps. But it suggests that really they're still stuck here trying to sort out what exactly to do next. And despite those public pronouncements, still trying to sort out how to break the logjam there at the Strait.
And Ed, as you know, the story of the week in terms of look-in interest nationwide has been the disclosure, first by the Washington Post, then confirmed by many others, including this network, about the misdirection in Ankara, Turkey, a month ago as the president was departing the NATO summit. What more relevant things have we learned about that, including those who were on the president's plane and not?
Yeah, well, essentially what we've learned, Major, is that this was a threat that was being tracked by the Secret Service, the CIA, the National Security Agency. They all worked together to inform the president and come up with this ruse. Given that the blue and white old school Air Force One was already in Turkey, made pulling this off a little easier. Bringing in that other smaller 757 that the president ultimately flew out on was part of that, ultimately. Remember, the new plane had been sent to the UK already out of concern that it was vulnerable to part of this attack. And our sense is that they were brought up by the president suggesting that the new plane had to go to the UK so the troops could take a look at it. We knew that was an odd cover story to begin with, and this all began when they admitted that the new plane wasn't ready. As for who was on which plane, the president, the defense secretary, and a handful of key, closer personal aides, including Walt Nauta, who was indicted with him in the Mar-a-Lago classified docs case, Dan Scavino, the deputy chief of staff, and Natalie Harp, one of his closest assistants, were all funneled onto that catering truck and taken to the other plane, while back on the bird that we thought was carrying the president to the UK was the Secretary of State and the Treasury Secretary, plus Stephen Miller, a handful of other senior White House staff, support staff, and dozens of Secret Service agents and journalists. And that is sort of the manifest as we know it at this point. This remains a topic of intrigue around here, certainly for those that were on the flight or might have been on the flight had it been their turn to fly in the pool. But other than that, the White House isn't commenting. And it's part of the reason we believe why we have not seen the president much in the last few days, because they don't want him taking questions on this specific topic, given the intrigue around it and the potential for the president, frankly, to say some things he probably shouldn't say or reveal.
And very quickly, Ed, speaking of taking questions, any sense at all as to who might replace Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt when she departs at the end of this month?
I think it's best for us to say that there are names circulating, but we don't know for certain who is definitely on that list. But it is a topic of conversation as well, and one the president is mulling over.
As we say in Washington, just wait for the great mentioner. The great mentioner will have your name. Ed O'Keefe, thank you very much.
Take care.
Officials said search and rescue efforts in the aftermath of the earthquake in Western Colombia entered its final phase today as the critical 72-hour window where most living victims are found draws to a close. Then, officials said, recovery efforts will commence. The death toll, 273, with nearly 4,000 injuries. Hundreds remain missing. CBS News national correspondent Lilia Luciano is following the latest.
We're in Pereira at a supply distribution center. This place is packed with volunteers who are gathering all kinds of supplies. They're telling me that the most important thing that they're getting is for children, for babies, diapers, baby formula, lotions. I was just talking to one of the organizers here. She was saying that there's a serious need for medication here in Pereira. The center of the city, everybody's displaced because there hasn't been an assessment 3 days since the earthquake of which buildings are safe. So she was telling, I was wondering whether we're talking about hundreds, thousands. She said, we have millions of people who are not safe to be in their homes, so they're scrambling to provide supplies to the available shelters, but there's not enough shelters for people to fit in because there's, according to them, millions of people who cannot be safely in their homes. That means that they're waiting for that international aid coming from multiple different countries, including from the U.S., which has committed more than $15 million. Mexico sent in a flight here to Pereira with aid. They're starting to slowly receive that aid, but much of it is coming from the private sector and from the national government in Colombia. As you can see, this place is bustling. I'm seeing bags of rice, just essential goods and needs for all of those people who are now out of a home. Cali is also in severe need. We're hearing that there are buildings that still have rescuers finding signs of life. That is where we are headed next to document the need that still exists there in Cali, which is the third largest city in Colombia. Just imagine the desperation. And as the days progress, how much more of that need will be documented, will be reported, and how much the international community will have to respond. We also know that World Central Kitchen is here starting to provide resources and supplies. Back to you.
Our thanks to Lilia Luciano. Still to come, Luigi Mangione and his attorneys may be inching toward a federal plea deal. What that could look like as we await tomorrow's court hearing. Remember that lawsuit the Trump administration filed against Harvard for allegedly, quote, enabling anti-Semitism, unquote? Well, it's gone. Why? A federal judge dismissed that case. And President Trump again is looking to make his mark on the Kennedy Center. What he's doing this time? One constant in all this? Defiance of a court order. The Takeout returns in 90 seconds. Welcome back to the Takeout. Sources tell CBS News Luigi Mangione could plead guilty tomorrow to a set of federal charges stemming from the 2024 murder of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson. Mangione is due in court tomorrow. Plea talks have been going on for weeks. Now, we won't know if a deal's been reached until Mangione agrees to it in court. Let's turn to CBS News legal contributor Caroline Police, who's been tracking this for us throughout. So we won't know anything until it actually happens. I know there's lots of conversation about this, Caroline, so we don't want to speculate about which we do not know, but there would be implications, double jeopardy and death penalty if a deal is reached, correct?
Absolutely. There are obviously not only implications for how his federal case is resolved, but obviously the state case. Now, on the federal side, what a deal could potentially look like is him pleading guilty to those stalking charges. Now, as you mentioned, that death penalty has been taken off the table, and it's not an option anymore. Remember, back several months ago, the federal judge dismissed the charges that carried with it the possibility of the death penalty. So that's not an option. But if he pleads guilty to those two stalking charges, the most he could get is life in prison without the possibility of parole. But there's, a possibility that he gets a number of years. That's lesser than life. And so what he could be aiming for in this plea agreement is perhaps the government arguing for some type of lesser sentence. You never get a guaranteed sentence when you enter into a federal plea deal, but he could be looking for a letter perhaps from the prosecutors to the sentencing judge to say, look, we don't necessarily think this merits a life in prison sentence. Or he could do an open plea wherein he would argue to the judge himself why he believes, that he shouldn't get life in prison. But you're right, it does have the state implications as well.
So walk us through the state implications, because the state has interests in this matter as well and doesn't want to be boxed out.
Absolutely. And so the state, since the very beginning of this case, Major, the defense attorneys for Luigi Mangione have been saying that this is a real miscarriage of justice, not the least of which is because of this double jeopardy issue. They had raised it earlier in the state court case, saying it's not constitutional for him to be prosecuted for the same crime in these two separate jurisdictions. At the time, the judge said that was a premature argument to be making because there was no conviction in the federal case. Now, a plea deal obviously changes that. And so everybody is speculating that this could essentially revive that double jeopardy argument in the state case. And what that is, it's not only a constitutional argument, but really in New York State, there's more robust protections for defendants around the double jeopardy laws. And so that could be a real issue here, at least one that would merit litigation, if not dismissal.
Caroline, the reasons for Luigi Mangione and his attorneys to negotiate this are obvious, death penalty and otherwise, even though that's off the table. Long prison sentence, life, and all that sort of stuff. What incentives, if any, if that's the proper word, exist for the prosecution on the federal side?
Yeah, exactly. A bargain is just that both sides should receive some sort of benefit. Even though the evidence in this case is very strong, what we've talked about from the beginning of this case is that public fascination with Luigi Mangione. And, in some circles, he's become a bit of a folk hero. So, the federal prosecutors are thinking of this case. It's never a slam dunk. When you have those 12 jurors, you just never know what could happen. And in this case in particular, you have a raised possibility of what we call juror nullification, wherein a jury gets seated and there's someone in there that just, regardless of hearing any of the evidence, is never going to vote to convict Luigi Mangione. And that's a real issue here. So the government gets a quick guilty plea on the books without that potential of going to trial and having things up in the air. So that's the benefit to the prosecutors. And then obviously the benefit to Mangione is perhaps a shot potentially at not being in prison for the rest of his natural life.
Caroline, isn't that idea of possible jury nullification on such a shocking ambush type of crime in itself kind of shocking?
Oh, it's absolutely shocking, but I've never actually seen a case where there might be a strong argument for prosecutors to consider it, given what we've seen around the case, given that he has so many supporters. It's a real contention. Now, look, the voir dire process and jury selection process is obviously meant to root out those types of people. But, there have been cases where some jurors sneak through the jury
Right.
picking process, and, they just will do what they want to do.
Caroline Polisi, great stuff. Thank you very, very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
The Trump Organization says it was debanked by Capital One, an act of political retribution. In a recent court filing, however, the bank said the actual reason that the Trump accounts drew attention was because of an anti-money laundering task force set of discoveries. We'll have more on that when we return. You're watching The Takeout. Welcome back to The Takeout. Welcome to the Conversation Corner. Here is a look at what else we and now you are watching this evening. A federal judge today dismissed the Department of Justice anti-Semitism lawsuit against Harvard. The administration accused Harvard of discrimination against Jewish and Israeli students, citing evidence linked to campus protests after the Gaza war began. In the dismissal, the judge said the incidents cited in that lawsuit were, quote, too isolated and episodic, unquote. The Kennedy Center board, comprised almost entirely of Trump loyalists, voted again to add the president's name to the Performing Arts Center, adding the inscription, quote, restored and renovated by President Donald J. Trump, unquote. This will test a federal judge's ruling from May, which found that only Congress can change the Kennedy Center's name. Capital One says it closed some of President Trump and his organization's accounts with their bank in 2021 because of money laundering concerns. Trump has sued the bank over the closures, alleging political retaliation following the January 6th Capitol riot. Ross Delston joins us now. He's an attorney and anti-money laundering specialist. Ross, when I read in this court filing submitted by Capital One, quote, it said the closures were the result of months of analysis and a careful review by Capital One's anti-money laundering team in accordance with bank policies and regulatory guidance. Ross, that did not sound to me like your garden variety legal filing. It sounded like a very big deal to me. Is it?
Well, it sounds like the bank did what it's supposed to do, which is to look at suspicious activities very carefully, particularly when there's an ultra high risk person like the president. At that point, he was the former president. So they did that. It sounds like they followed the rules correctly. And yes, a high risk account that's dabbling in suspicious activities for which suspicious activity reports have been filed, possibly. We're not allowed to know about that in any detail because it's protected by law. Yeah, all of that sounds like the right thing for a bank to do.
And I understand there are times in litigation when both sides will flex and accuse each other of things to try to get to a settlement or get to something. This feels like Capital One is doing in a way that is beyond that sort of legal typical flexing. It's disclosing something it was not trying to initially disclose, but with a countersuit filed by the Trump organization, felt it was obligated to do so.
Well, there certainly is an implied threat, as you've said, which is you really want to pursue us, Mr. President. We've got lots of bad stuff that we analyzed, investigated, that we documented about your accounts. If you want us to release that, we could. I mean, that's the implied threat.
Right. And we should just stand back for a second, Ross, and say 2021, he's no longer the president, but this would suggest activities while he was president. I'm a pretty good student of presidential history, Ross. I don't remember a previous episode where a president, even just slightly removed from office, had ever been accused of having anything close to money laundering implications about his finances.
Well, we have to be careful here, Major, that we're not clear on what the suspicious activities were. Yes, it could be money laundering. It could also be some other type of financial crime. It could be insider trading because the president gets awfully close to that. It could be corruption because the president has a propensity to get into that sort of violation of law, or at least allegations of violations of law. But whatever it is, it's also not clear what the time period is, whether it's while he was president or after he was president, or for that matter, before he was president. I mean, they're supposed to document all of this as part of their investigation.
And we're talking about some 325 accounts over about a decade or longer, Ross. So this is a longstanding relationship.
Yes, and any bank that is brave enough to take on the president doesn't have a lot of my sympathies. The president is a man who has defaulted on loans to banks. He has sued banks. He sues vendors. He's declared bankruptcy multiple times. So you really want this guy as a client? Good luck.
And Ross, before I let you go, if it were me and I were accused by a bank in litigation of this, I would be screaming at the top of my lungs, I didn't do it. I may have missed that response from the Trump organization, but I haven't come across it.
Well, it isn't clear. He certainly talks a lot about reputation and retaliation and political stuff. It isn't clear all of his defenses at this point. But if you were to ever be accused of such a thing, you have to remember, and this is the president's risk here, which is the more he talks about it, the more it's known. So he's not going to win this case. I mean, people ask me whether I would take cases like this. I don't take hopeless cases. But by talking about it, he's making it known to a broader audience. Why do that?
From Ross Delston, hopeless case. I appreciate the time, sir, and your expertise. Thank you.
Thank you.
The Grant Plattner saga rattled Maine Democrats for weeks. Now they're on the other side of that. They have a new Senate nominee, Troy Jackson. You see him right there. Challenging GOP incumbent Susan Collins. Our political panel will assess a new Fox poll that shows that race essentially tied. You're watching The Takeout.
I have to ask, where do you stand on Thanksgiving?
I like Thanksgiving. My favorite dish is dressing.
Okay. Mr. David Crowley.
Chicken dressing for my sister-in-law.
That is the nominee for governor in Wisconsin, the Democratic nominee, David Crowley, on CNN last night. Preserving, of course, Thanksgiving, which was put into some manner of jeopardy by Francesca Hung, the other Democrat who was against David Crowley in that race. She lost narrowly by some 3,000 votes. Political panel time. Doug Heye is with us, Republican strategist, and he was Deputy Chief of Staff. House Majority Leader Eric Cantor, back when he was roaming Capitol Hill. Ophira Yeskel is the current Director of External Affairs for the Democratic Governors Association. So let's start there. Wisconsin and Minnesota. Talk to me about those governor's races.
Well, we're really excited, obviously.
I'm sure you are. Let's skip that part.
Yeah. Well, okay, so there was great turnout and energy for Democrats.
The turnout numbers are important.
Yeah, and I think that energy really bodes well for us heading into these midterms where Republicans are really vulnerable, and bringing it back to Wisconsin.
Why did David Crowley win?
I think he had a really clear message on the economy.
Yeah, but he jumped back in at the last minute. Was it about nervousness about Francesca Hung and the whole DSA thing?
I think folks and Democrats in Wisconsin really want to win, and they both made really great cases, I think, on the economy. And at the end of the day, we're really excited about who we ended up with. And Tom Tiffany.
Because it's a different race than Tom Tiffany, the Republican nominee, was anticipating and preparing for.
Totally. And the RGA spent $5 million, lit it on fire, trying to meddle in our primary. And David Crowley ended up on top.
But you're not upset about them letting $5 million
No, I love to see it. I love to see money let
Talk to me about Minnesota and Amy Klobuchar.
Amy Klobuchar also in a great position. I think we've got two great, strong chances for Midwestern governors who are going to be focused on how they can lower.
And what about
costs for
legislative
folks.
races beneath those governors?
Well, obviously, I think that's even better. In Wisconsin, too, real chance at a trifecta for the first time in a long time. And so with Governor David Crowley, hopefully he'll have a Democratic trifecta that unlocks a lot of achievements in his ability to really deliver for folks in Wisconsin.
Doug, take it away.
I think what we saw was also a victory of team normal. And we've seen a lot of victories where it hasn't been team normal who's turned out on top for Republicans and Democrats.
Right. In the governor's race in Minnesota, Team Normal defeated Mike Lindell, who is contesting the election results, though he lost by 12 points. Brother, man, come on.
And in his video, it appears that he's driving his car while talking. So
also unsafe.
A lot of listen, I remember
at any speed, ladies and gentlemen.
I remember being on Fox News the Friday after the 22 midterms where I said, please stay away from the pillow salesman. Plural. Both parties have attracted so many cartoon characters. And what they do is, one, they cost you races. And I think certainly.
And reputation.
And reputation nationally. And that's what we see. Every Democrat now is being asked about Thanksgiving. And they'll be asked about football because Al Saeed has made negative comments about football as a sport.
And fireworks.
And and what it means, and 4th of July. And you can go down this whole laundry list that Republicans have had to deal with as well. And it distracts you from your message of what you want to be talking about. And very clearly, the economy and President Trump's numbers are terra firma for Democrats right now, if they can stay on it.
Talk to me about Maine, Doug, because the Fox News poll has Troy Jackson 48, Susan Collins, the incumbent, 46. That's the margin of error. I'm just going to call it a tie. It's not a lead. How do you evaluate that?
Look, that's going to go down to the wire. You know, it's one of the
staying power for a Democratic Party that was in chaos 6 weeks ago.
Absolutely. And look, Team Normal won there as well.
Took a bit of doing.
As it turned out. Took a lot of doing. And Grant Plattner is going to be back on the campaign trail we've just seen.
In a controversial way. He's going to show up at some county event, and those who are very much alarmed by his overall personal conduct, consider this a bad look.
Very bad look. And if you want him on the campaign trail, in theory, he should have been your candidate as well, especially after he won the primary. But I look at Maine in the same way I look at Marcy Kaptur's race in Ohio. These are two, Susan Collins and Marcy Kaptur. Every time they run, this is the time they're going to lose, and they never get defeated. So this is going to go down to the wire, of course, but
it's a long shot.
It's never happened before for either one of them. And so if anybody can win this race in this environment, it's Susan Collins. But it's a tough race and it's a bad environment.
Fear, I want to talk to you about something else. One thing that Republicans, and Doug knows about this, for the last 2 decades have really focused on state legislatures. Democrats have not. Matter of fact, during the Obama years, the great Obama years for the Democratic Party, hundreds upon hundreds of state legislative seats went to the Republicans because they focused on this. Now, Pete Buttigieg, in Indiana at least, is beginning to endorse people who are not national names. They're not even Indiana names, trying to build a team in the legislature. Is this something Democrats are going to start taking seriously because they were basically out to lunch for so long?
I mean, it won't surprise you, Major. I think that the power's in the states. And so I'm enthused to see folks really paying attention to state legislative races. And again, those folks are working with governors. I think I'm excited about Wisconsin again because we can elect David Crowley, but also the energy we saw in Wisconsin can mean that they unlock a trifecta for the first time in a long time. And with a governor who has a trifecta, that means a lot of progress for everyday folks in terms of lowering costs, achievements like that. So I do think this focus is great. And this energy that we're seeing for Democrats in midterms, I think, has some staying power to go all the way down the ballot to lift up some folks in state legislatures.
And Doug, you witnessed this tail of the tape for Republicans and their emphasis on this for years.
Absolutely. And, you know, in North Carolina, my home state.
Shrewd, very smart.
It's very smart, and it builds the farm team for those next candidates for Congress, for Senate, and so forth. And North Carolina, for a while, had a supermajority of Republicans in the General Assembly. They just lost that by 1 vote. That changes the entire calculus in the city of Raleigh. Anytime you have that happen in a state capital, it's a really big deal.
And it's something that the RNC and related interested Republican parties are going to have to start paying attention to if Democrats at long last start focusing on these
100%.
State races.
100%. And so much of what happens in Washington starts in the states. Good ideas do not start in Washington. They may end up here. We'll see. But they start in the states, and that's why this is an important fight.
Anything else you want to add on that?
I agree with Doug for once. A lot of good things are coming out of states, and I think Democratic governors obviously are at the precipice of that, and looking forward to electing a lot more of them this year.
Excellent. Vera Yesko, Doug, hi. I appreciate your time very much. Security, empowerment, and opportunity. That's how political commentator Lenny McAllister outlines his vision for achieving the American dream in his new book. It's called A Venn Diagram of One. Our conversation is next, right here on The Takeout. Welcome back. At this time of pretty intense divisions across the country, a new memoir offers a framework for America's second act. In A Venn Diagram of One, an American story, Lenny McAllister shares his vision for restoring the American dream through hope, action, and the power of the pivot. Here is part of our conversation. Lenny, I got to tell you, the title of your book knocks me out because I need you to explain it to me because it's curious. Venn Diagram of One.
Yes.
That's not what they're supposed to be. Help me understand.
Well, it's twofold. Number one, my book, it looks like a political book, it looks like a public policy book, but it's actually a memoir. It's a civic roadmap. It's a memoir of my life, and it's a love letter to the American experiment. But it talks about my life as a Venn diagram of one. Somebody that can work at the RNC under Michael Steele, also work at Rainbow Push with the late Jesse Jackson Sr. Somebody that can work with the NAACP, but also go to Tea Party events. Somebody that's comfortable talking about domestic violence and the scourge of domestic violence, but also talk about school choice.
Someone who's been at CPAC, but can also talk to the ACLU.
Yes, exactly. For example, I had a project, I talk about it in the book, where I'm working with Americans for Prosperity and the ACLU on criminal justice reform, and being the linchpin that allows both sides to talk to each other. Another example in a Venn diagram of one, I talk about the Tea Party group working with old Black Panthers on the south side of Chicago to talk about education reform for poor African Americans on the south side of Chicago. To be able to be that individual and be comfortable doing that, There's not a lot of people that do that, Major. That, in essence, is the Venn diagram of one. But what I also wanted to take was the fact that in me doing that, it highlights the example of what America is. America, as a nation, is a Venn diagram of one. It's an overlaying of different subcultures over and over with different iterations of Americans coming in and being part of our fabric, from Western Europe at the beginning of the 20th century to people that are coming here today and making the definition of America unique. In essence, that unique Venn diagram of one as a nation.
That argues against what lots of Americans are being told to do right now.
Yes.
Find themselves in 5 or 6 different Venn diagrams.
Yes. We need to be part of what makes us common. There are still common American values that allow this country to work, and I actually make the case in the book for us to go back to that: security, empowerment, and opportunity, and allowing those 3 pillars to be available for all Americans. What I do throughout the book, Major, is I make sure that people can see, regardless of your background, rich, poor, black, white, immigrant, or native born, if you're able to have access to those 3 values over the course of 250 years, you can find your way in America. That's what we need to get back to, the overlaying of those values, not the echo chambers that we've been told over recent years that we must belong to, that tribalism that's going to allow us to be winners or losers.
So, Lenny, I'm a man of a certain age. I'll be 64 in a couple of weeks, which means I remember the language of the 60s and 70s. And part of the language of the 60s and 70s was, where are you coming from? Where are you coming from? Who are you? So in our political tribalist ways, if I want to ask you that question, because people want to know, where are you coming from? Are you Trump light Republican? Are you Democrat? Are you independent? Are you estranged? Where are you? What do you come? When you talk about this book and your experiences in your life, where are you coming from now?
I think first and foremost, Major, I come from it from a perspective of being a child of God. I come to it as a perspective of being an American, being a proud African American, and then living out certain values with those 3 identities first. Then subsequent to that, because I am a black Republican, what do I stand for, both with the history of the Republican Party in tow, but also what the future of the Republican Party should be, standing up for constitutional conservatism, making sure that civil rights are something that we make sure that all Americans enjoy. Those are the identities I try to lean on, less about
so where
the
does
current
Trump
identity.
figure into that?
Certain policies we agree upon. I would say that the school choice aspect of what the Trump administration's both Part 1 and Part 2 tried to emphasize, I do enjoy. Other things I would definitely say, there are things I push it back against. I don't think tariff wars are good things when it comes to free market principles. Tariffs are not things that Republicans talked about or embraced over the course of the last 100 plus years. So there are definitely places where we diverge.
You talk about citizenship in the book, deep in the book. How about immigration and the approach Trump 2.0?
Well,
pretty aggressive.
It has been. And Major, I actually talk about that. How can we address immigration? Who belongs here? Who doesn't? And how do we address that humanely? How do we make sure that we don't break and breach the sentiment of the 14th Amendment so that people do have due process while adjudicating that? That's still important, making sure that people have that 14th Amendment citizenship that's there as well, that birthright citizenship that has been attacked by this administration. I argue in the book, A Venn Diagram of One, that this has been long established, and we need to make sure that that citizenship is secure. That's one of the pillars I talk about. Security of citizenship, so that people, once they can stand upon that foundation, they can then go chase that empowerment and that opportunity they're looking for in America.
Here's a quick reminder. The Takeout is available as a podcast on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and everywhere else. You can find each show there and our long-form interviews, of which we do many, including my full interview with Lenny McAllister. Happy Thursday, everyone. This is The Takeout, relentlessly curious, reliably civil, and occasionally clever. The Daily Report is next.